Hello again. This is going to be the first of two videos that I'm going to be making about Destined Death. In this video, I'll talk about what I think Destined Death is and the effect it has on the world before moving on to things like the Gloam-Eyed Queen and Deathbirds. Then in part 2, we'll discuss the rest of the people that have used Destined Death before we go over one of the most important events in the story, the Night of Black Knives. Destined Death, also known as the Rune of Death, is one of the most important topics in Elden Ring, but it's also one of the more mysterious topics. Details related to Destined Death are vague, so one of the only things we know for sure is that it powers the god-slaying black flame, which, as the name suggests, is one of the only things capable of killing a god. The Mending Rune of the Death Prince says that if it's used to repair the Elden Ring, it would embed the concept of life within death into the New Order, and that would restore death. So that means the Rune of Death isn't just death, it's the concept of life within death. Just as life can exist in death, death can exist in life, but when Destined Death was sealed away, only life within death was removed. The Scarlet Rot is called the death that creates life, and if you think about it, rot comes from living things. Things rot when plants, fungi, or bacteria break a substance down into the nutrients needed to create new life, and scarlet rot comes from the spores of the Scarlet Aeonia. This kind of death comes from life and creates life, so it wouldn't have been stopped by sealing the Rune of Death. I think Gowry says that demigods weren't able to stop the scarlet rot even when the Erd Tree was at its strongest because the rot takes advantage of a big loophole in the Golden Order. It doesn't kill the infected, it breaks them down into a sort of living sludge like the Lake of Rot and the Swamp of Aeonia. When Destined Death was sealed, I think that meant souls couldn't leave bodies, because new life couldn't be born into death anymore. If souls and bodies are inseparable, then the rot is breaking the soul into pieces along with the body, and the Swamp of Aeonia is just a jumble of little pieces of bodies and souls. So the Kindred of Rot may spontaneously emerge from the swamp because those pieces come together and become a new being sometimes. I think that would also help explain why they have so many human hands, and in a way, it kind of sounds like grafting. In fact, I think one of the big reasons that grafting is possible is because of how the law of regression behaves when souls and bodies can't be separated. The law of regression is like a law of physics, that says things will naturally try to return to a previous state if possible. And the very first form of all life was when it was mixed together in the crucible of life. Scarlet Rot and grafting are great examples of just how entirely useless and maybe even counterproductive it was for Marika to seal the Rune of Death. Even if true death is impossible, a living being can be rearranged and put together into something entirely different, which is still essentially death, but more horrifying. There are some fates worse than death, and most of them are only possible when you can't die. Deathbirds were responsible for the dead before the Erd Tree, so I think they were associated with Destined Death somehow. They're called graveyard firekeepers because they make sure that a special fire called Ghost Flame never completely dies out. In real life, firekeepers used to do this so that there would always be a source of fire if someone needed it. The reason the job was so important is because it's very difficult to start a fire from scratch. The Deathbirds fueled the Ghost Flame by collecting the dead and cremating them in their kilns with the ancient Death Hex. I think that this freed people's spirits from their bodies so that they could move on, but some vengeful spirits remained. Those spirits are a lot like wraiths, which are vengeful spirits of those that died while cursed. Souls that can't return to the Erd Tree for whatever reason are often said to be cursed, so I think curses stop souls from moving on properly. After something is burned, the remaining material that can't burn anymore is called cinders, like ashes. So I think wraiths are cinders of Ghost Flame because they're cursed and can't be completely burned. Even though Destined Death was sealed away, items like the Blasphemous Claw and Black Knives still have bits of the rune's power inside them, because they were imbued with Death's power directly. There's a jagged cut right down the center of both items, So my best guess is that the imbuing is done when something that already contains Death's power is used to scratch or cut into another object. The Deathbirds also have jagged cuts down the center of their bodies, so I think that they've been imbued with Destined Death's power in a similar way. I think the Death Sorcery crest is what the curse mark of death would have looked like if it had taken the shape of a circle like it was supposed to. And I think it's why the sorceries are enhanced by the Prince of Death's staff. A piece of Godwyn is in the staff, and the curse mark of death was carved into his body with a black knife. I think the Black Knife assassins killed Godwyn by imbuing him with death, meaning I also think the curse mark of death is what's been carved into the Deathbirds, Blasphemous Claw, and Black Knives. So I believe Deathbirds and Ghost Flame are probably powered by Destined Death, but in a way that's somehow different from the Black Knives. I'm not totally sure why they're so different if they're both powered by Destined Death, but I think the Dark Moon has something to do with it. Ghost Flame is cold, and most attacks or enemies that inflict frostbite are connected to the Dark Moon. The mother of all Deathbirds is an envoy for an outer god, so I think that god is the Dark Moon or represents it somehow. Also, this might not be related, but it's worth noting that Deathbirds look like they're several bodies fused together. It kind of reminds me of the way bodies are absorbed by great tree roots in the catacombs, but I'm not totally sure what it means. As far as we know, the first individual to wield the power of Destined Death was an Empyrean called the Gloam-Eyed Queen. Gloam is another word for dusk, which is of course when day fades to night. I like to think it symbolizes the fact that she's between life and death, but leaning towards death. The Gloam-Eyed Queen's followers wore robes sewn from patches of skin, and were known as the Godskin Apostles. We've been led to believe that Marika is the only god and always has been, but many things about the Godskins seem to prove that was a lie. For instance, the oldest of the Apostles are the Godskin nobles, and they went on a god hunt a long time ago. It looks like they hunted a lot of gods too, because I think the nobles' robes are literally made from the skin of gods. A noble's robe will strengthen the noble presence incantation, which was a power once used by the gods that they hunted. That's important because in Elden Ring, imitators seem to slowly become more like whatever they're imitating. For instance, the Ravenmount assassins had to make themselves feel constant pain to remember that they were human just because they were dressed as Deathbirds. There are also the Drake and Bloodhound Knights that seem to imitate dragons and beasts respectively, even going so far as to never say a single word. So I think the Godskin nobles wear godskin to imitate the gods and use their power. The nobles are even said to have absorbed inhuman qualities, and my guess is that it's because of their robes. The Godskin nobles' signature robes are each made from 7 faces. So not only is the idea of there only being one god wrong, it seems like there was once something like an entire clan or even a dynasty of gods. There are ancient remnants of some mysterious dynasty that we know almost nothing about in the Underground and Liurnia. I think this dynasty was made up of one or more families of gods that were hunted down by the Gloam-Eyed Queen's Godskin Apostles. But a full explanation of that deserves a video of its own. Ronnie tells us that an Empyrean is a demigod that can become a god, but that could mean gods are still Empyreans. The Gloam-Eyed Queen was an Empyrean, so she may have been related to the gods that her apostles were hunting. She may have even used the power of Destined Death to kill them and rule over everything herself. That's mostly just speculation, though. I'm pretty confident that the Gloam-Eyed Queen was a member of the Carian royal family for several reasons. The first is that godskins mostly show up in places connected to the Carians. A godskin noble appears before the Divine Tower of Liurnia, where Ranni's body is, and an apostle is in the basement of Radahn's Divine Tower in Caelid. Also, the skill Spinning Weapon was used by Carian princesses, and when the godskin apostles attack by spinning their weapons in front of them, it looks just like Spinning Weapon. One of the most interesting things, however, is that there's a godskin noble in the Temple of Iglay connected to Rykard's Volcano Manor. There are only 3 Black Flame monks in the entire game, and one of them guards this temple that houses a snakeskin shed by the Great Serpent. The skin is right above the altar as if it's being worshipped, and I think that there's a real connection between the serpent's worship of skin and the godskin's use of skin. In fact, the godskins and serpent men have a lot in common. The godskin apostles can stretch out just like the man-serpents, and nobles have serpentine tails. The Gloam-Eyed Queen has a lot of connections to Mount Gelmir actually, but that's a pretty deep rabbit hole, so we'll have to wait until part 2 to discuss it more. If the Gloam-Eyed Queen is a Carian, my best guess is that she's one of Ranni's sisters named Renna. Behind Caria Manor is an area called Three Sisters, and in this area we can find 3 towers, also called rises. 2 of them are Ranni's rise and Renna's rise. Renna is probably Ranni's sister and Renala's daughter, because the name Renna is Renala's name without the last 2 letters. The 3rd rise is called Celivis's rise because that's who's living in it at the time, but I believe it was once Selen's. The area is called Three Sisters, and that's almost definitely because 3 Carian princesses lived there. And unless she's just an unknown princess, I don't know who else that 3rd one could have been. There was a backup puppet made specifically for Selen in Celivis's hidden chamber right by his rise. And in the debate hall, there are portraits of Selen reading scrolls with Carian crests on them. We can find the Snow Witch set at the top of Renna's rise, and it's the first of several hints that I believe imply that Renna was the Snow Witch that taught Ranni about the Dark Moon and its ice sorceries. There's also the fact that a Carian princess once used the ice crest shown on the ice crest shield. Lastly, Ranni is using a puppet body designed to look like her mentor and introduced herself as Renna when we first met. So it really seems like she just faked her death and then took on her sister's identity as Renna. Ranni was mentored by Renna secretly, which may sound strange, but it's important to remember that the Academy saw the Snow Witch as a heretic. Royalty or not, I don't think Renna would have been able to train her sister in public without upsetting the Academy, because they really hate heretical sorceries. Speaking of heretics, there are some interesting details concerning the Heretical Rise and Spirit Caller Cave that lead me to believe Renna may have left Liurnia to live on the mountaintop of the Giants, perhaps after being shunned by the Academy. The spell Founding Rain of Stars is at the top of the Heretical Rise. The spell was discovered by an astrologer, and the telescope's description says that the Carians were once astrologers, so Renna may be one of the only heretical sorcerers that would reasonably be associated with that spell, except maybe Selen. I don't think it's Selen because a lot of things are pointing to ice, snow, and Renna here. There's an invisible path behind the tower that can only be seen when falling snowflakes land on it. It would be very appropriate for the Snow Witch to incorporate snow into the tower's secret somehow, and the fact that it's invisible may be important too. Some of the night sorceries practiced in Celia can make things semi-invisible, and the Carians have connections to them as well. They're both connected to the Eternal Cities in various ways, and Radahn studied gravity magic there. The only connection Selen has with the town is the fact that she got the Celian Sealbreaker from a Celian, and that Lusat is there. I think that Selen probably lived in the Albinoric Rise because the Graven Mass Talisman is found at the top of the rise, and she's known as the Graven Witch. The talisman is made from the first school of Graven Mages, and it's exactly what Selen looks like at the end of her quest when she presumably merges with Lusat and Azur. Another reason I think Renna lived in the Heretical Rise is related to the cave almost directly under it. Spirit Caller Cave is full of snails that can summon spirits, and like I mentioned before, Ranni calls herself Renna when she gives us the similarly named Spirit Calling Bell. The white reed set is on a corpse inside the cave, and the snails summon spirits of white reed warriors, so I think it's safe to say that the spirits died in the cave. The final snail summons the spirits of a godskin noble and apostle, and it drops the godskin swaddling cloth that was used by the Gloam-Eyed Queen herself. That makes me think that they may have lived there, and the godskin swaddling cloth could even mean that they were born there. Ranni says the Spirit Calling Bell is a gift from Torrent's former owner, but Melina's the one that owned Torrent before us. I believe the bell was Renna's because of all her connections to spirit summoning, So this might sound weird at first, but I think that Renna, Melina, and the Gloam-Eyed Queen are just different names for one person. In my opinion, the Frenzied Flame ending does almost everything it can to say Melina is the Gloam-Eyed Queen without outright saying it. Melina walks through the ashes of the Erd Tree and picks up the spectral steed whistle before it sinks into her hand, which essentially confirms that Melina was Torrent's original owner. Then she opens the eye that she always keeps closed, and it could absolutely be called dusk-colored. The most direct part, though, is when she essentially looks straight at the camera and says, "Destined Death." And the reason she's talking about death is because she's swearing to kill us with it, meaning she can use its power. So it sounds like one of the only possible explanations for all this is that Melina is the Gloam-Eyed Queen. There are a few strange details in Melina's background that seem to contradict her Carian connections, but I don't think it could be anyone else, so I'll do my best to address them. First, Melina is generally considered to be Marika's daughter because she tells us that her mother is inside the Erd Tree. But if that's entirely true, then she probably couldn't be a Carian. One thing that seems to support this idea is a game file related to Melina that has been named Marika of Daughter. Everything Melina tells us about her mother strongly implies it's Marika, but it's important to note that she never gets specific. She never says a single descriptive thing about her mother. So, in my opinion, everything about this screams red herring. They give us all these details that make the answer seem obvious, but they never actually provide us with anything that suggests it may be true. Regarding the file name, the developers at From Software know how far fans will go to try to find bits of lore. There's no doubt in my mind at all that every developer at FromSoft knew content creators would go digging in the game's files and see this file name. And I just really don't think they'd give us such an easy answer like that. I'm not saying Melina is lying, though. I just think that there's a much less obvious answer that fits into what she tells us. So I do have one idea that I think would fit with everything Melina says about her mother without making it impossible for her to be a Carian. The Regal Ancestor Remembrance says that life sprouts from death and birth, and I think this means that when someone dies, they're born into death. So, Renna, the Gloam-Eyed Queen, may have been killed by Marika at the foot of the Erd Tree, and was then born as Melina. This would mean that Melina was born burnt and bodiless within death, and her scrambled memories can only recall that Marika is the one that gave her this new life. It's a rough idea, but I think it makes sense. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, I'd appreciate it if you left a like and subscribed. That's about all I have on the Gloam-Eyed Queen's identity, but in part 2 we'll go over her connections to Mount Gelmir and the Godskin's Black Flame in a little bit more detail. We'll discuss the Knight of Black Knives last, though, because a lot of things from part 1 and part 2 come together there. I make TikToks about video games like Elden Ring, No Man's Sky, and Pokemon, and if you'd ever like to chat or just hang out, then come and join me on Twitch every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 6 to 8 p.m. Central Time. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.